Welcome to Oceanside Chat, Light Beyond Generations. This podcast was created to inspire, motivate, and provide insight through industry professionals sharing personal stories, career aspirations, and practical advice. As well as being an engaging board member at ISEI, our guest, Tom Linton, is a visionary leader and an award-winning Chief Supply Chain Officer who co-authored the book Living Supply Chain about building digitalized and real-time supply chains. Time to get your feet wet in the business world and join us down by the water as we have an Oceanside Chat. Season 2, Episode 2, The Soul of Supply Chain.
Welcome to Oceanside Chat. I'm Helen Wang, the host and editor of the program. I want to thank our students, faculty, and industry professionals who attend today's live event. Supply chain management started with labor-intensive process and eventually evolved to engineering and managing global networks. From 1940 to 1990, logistic management was front and center, advanced by operation research to improve transportation efficiency. However, since mid-1990s, globalization movement and manufacturing growth trended away from logistic function to operational-centric and strategy-driven challenges. As summarized by McKinsey, over the last 30 years, logistics has undergone a tremendous change from a purely operational function that reported to sales or manufacturing to an independent supply chain management function that in some companies is already being led by the Chief Supply Chain Officer. The focus of supply chain management function has shifted to advance the planning process. Logistics has been outsourced to third-party providers. The supply chain function ensures integrated operations from customers to suppliers. Furthermore, supply chain executives are now leading great organizations. For example, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, and Mary T. Barra, the CEO of General Motors, are both supply chain veterans. In this episode, I'm pleased to introduce Tom Linton, who is a visionary leader and award-winning supply chain officer, a senior advisor at McKinsey, also a long-term board member for our Institute for Supply Chain Excellence and Innovation at UC San Diego. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Helen. Glad to be here.
You are one of the chief supply chain officers that I know win most of the awards. Let me just name a few of them. The Institute of Supply Management's J. Shipman Gold Medal and Gartner's Supply Chain Innovator Award, the Procurement Leaders Award on Global Risk Management, as well as Chief Procurement Officer Hall of Fame. And there's more. But seriously, Tom, what do your family and friends think you do all day?
They have no idea. They know it's supply chain, but what's interesting is very few people really understand what that means, right? The word supply chain almost becomes synonymous with problem in the last couple of years. So people just go, oh, when you say supply chain, I'm sure you all experience it because it's just in the news. I was reading just this week that it's the #1 most used word in earnings calls this quarter. So it's pretty well known at this point.
Yeah. Before getting to the supply chain, I'm curious, what would your talent be if you were Mr. World?
I don't know. Like most people, I kind of fell into supply chain and procurement just because where I was early in my career, you go back in the 70s and early 80s, you just got assigned to a function and that's where you get started. So I've always probably been more creative than practical, and supply chain is more of an operations thing. If anything, I like dabbling in art and things like that. I'm probably a little bit more on the creative side than maybe other supply chain people tend to be in operations. That kind of comes out in the way I think about things.
I think people get to know your creative side more throughout the episode. Who are the most influential people in your life?
Well, I mean, my father was for sure. I remember when I was looking at career options coming out of university and I had opportunities with like IBM and GE, and IBM actually had two different interviews for me. One was in sales and one was in something called contracting purchasing. And I went to my dad and I said, what do you think? I was 22 years old in college. I had no idea what that meant. And he was in GE at the time. And he said, I don't think you're a sales guy. I think you're more of a materials guy. So, I mean, just my dad's message there had me swing towards materials. At that time, it was called materials and purchasing. I think transportation, purchasing materials was kind of the area I ended up in. But it was so very influential, that one comment had on my life. But I also kind of influenced, I think, a lot by what's happening in the world. I remember reading Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations back very early in my college days, and the invisible hand of the economy and how that influences the world we live in today, supply, demand, and things like that, and how business flows and moves. And I was just kind of always intrigued by books like that, which were more kind of economics. I really always thought about, both macro and microeconomics and how that really fits into the world. So things along those lines would be kind of where I was kind of always thinking. More recently, in the first book I did with Rob Hanfield, The Living Supply Chain, we really took a more biological look at supply chain, or the corollaries or analogies to the environment, how supply chains work. If you think of the ocean, for example, as an ecosystem, or how elk and aspen and predators in the West operate as an ecosystem. I mean, the supply chains are like that, right? You have OEMs, you have suppliers, and they all feed into each other the same way that the natural world does. So we're kind of fascinated by how there are real parallels between the natural world and the physical world, really along those lines. And that's why in our second book, which is coming out next month, called Flow, we're really looking at more the physical side of the supply chain, not the more biological side of the supply chain, or at least those analogies. And so I kind of look at things really broadly that way. I kind of see things and how they flow and how they fit together and how they move, in kind of a macro view of the system of a supply chain, and how that works well together. And when the supply chain is functioning well, right, that system is working well. And I think that's kind of not just functionally or process or things like that, but more of that kind of view of the world.
Very interesting. And thanks for sharing your personal story. How did you start your career influenced by your father? Our students are very curious, like what's the right career for them to start when they are still in college and have no idea what's out there. And I'm curious about, from career standpoint, a lot of people that I talk to in the current generation of supply chain profession, as well as older generations, it feels like they almost started the supply chain career by accident. It's just sort of the fate led them that way. And I'm curious about, with today's emphasis on supply chain, would that change for the future generation who might be interested in this profession? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I agree with something you said up front. I think supply chain is rapidly going to be standing alone as really the glue that a corporation has to have. I've had this opportunity, but as a chief supply chain officer, you should be reporting to a CEO. I think to dilute it and bury it suboptimizes the financial outcomes that a company can experience, because supply chain is really all about the balance sheet. It's about cash. It's about material in motion. And when it's not moving, it causes inventory. And so the flow of material through a company, or the motion associated with it, is essential. And so that's the balance sheet of a company. I think, you look at the purchasing function, it's more of a cost or income statement aligned function. And so, you look at balance sheet and income statement, and then you say, okay, revenue. But if you speed up your business and your supply chain is working effectively, you grow revenue, because in the same period of time, you can produce more days, right? If you reduce your inventory days and you compress it, you create more days to produce product, therefore you can increase your revenue. So there's this whole alignment between the financial outcomes that supply chain and procurement do to the engine of a company. We're like literally the circulation system of that company. And so the old mind of functional engines operating independently is really a bad one, because You really want to have a very integrated company, which is really governed by the movement of material, which is a supply chain part. Now we got to think how things move through the company. Material comes in, they go through manufacturing, finished goods out the door, but that velocity is really what drives corporate success, I think, in this century. It really is about that efficiency. So you get underneath that another layer and you start to say, well, why are my suppliers so far away? I need to get my suppliers closer to me. It facilitates the speed. And in one article I wrote, if you talk about supply chain, and this is really for some of the students, speed is the theory of everything. You know, in science, they always talk, what's the theory of everything? Well, in supply chain, speed is the theory of everything, because the faster things go, the better the financial outcomes or the achievement of the supply chain. So inventory turns, the customer satisfaction, revenue growth, cost reduction, cash, all those things are benefited by speed. So why have we designed supply chains that are stretched all over the earth when speed wins?
So back to professional career, what were the biggest risks that you took and later on become an award for you?
Well, this goes back to 1987. I was doing very well in IBM. I was like 25, 26-year-old, purchasing site manager, a second level position, very young in my career. And some executives were saying, I think you should have some international experience. And at the time, there was no PC. This is before the internet. Basically, it was all big mainframes that were governing IBM's future. And I remember thinking, I really should get some international experience. And a bunch of people said, you're going to kill your career. You don't want to do that. Don't go to Japan in 1987. Don't do it. You're going to kill your career. You need to go down and work in mainframes or something like that for your future. So I went to Japan. Well, history now tells us that was the right thing to do, right? Because at the time, no one was doing that. And so that was a very pivotal point in my life. Going to Japan, I spent the next 23 years in Asia. Rode both the PC boom, the internet boom, and then became a very senior executive at LG Corporation in Korea. Obviously had tremendous experience across the range of supply chains. So yeah, there are certain things I always tell people today. I said, you don't know what you should do, but be directionally correct. Don't rely on the advice of people who think the way things were. Think about what it's going to be like 10 years from now. If you were to plan your life, your career 10 years from now, you should say, okay, if you're 30 years old, where do I want to be at 40 years old? And then plan backwards. Don't plan forwards. Don't say, what should I do next? Say, where do I want to be in 10 years? And then plot your course. But where do you want to be in 20 years? Then plot your course. And then what you do is you head that direction. And I always wanted to be a chief procurement officer very early in my career. I probably should have designed my career to be, okay, I should have been a chief executive officer, but I didn't plan it that way. So I didn't do the jobs you need to do in order to be a chief executive officer, but I did all the jobs I needed to do to be a chief procurement officer. So I think by planning your life and your career that way, you're going to be in much better shape than if you just kind of plod along and take jobs. Like a recruiter called, I'm going to take this job. Yeah, but does it fit your plan? Do you have a plan? Where do you want to be? What are your goals? Things like that. My dad always said to me, you have to follow your strong suit, know what you're good at, know what your competencies are. And if you don't, there's a lot of online things that'll help you, Myers-Briggs and others will help you understand what your competencies are. And then look at those very seriously and say, okay, how do I use those competencies in my goals in my career? You don't want to push a rope your whole life. You don't want to be doing something you shouldn't be doing. You won't be happy. So you might as well figure out what you're good at and then look at your goals far enough in advance to say, okay, now how do I use my strengths to get there?
Yeah, that's a great story. Sort of plan backwards, right? Have a very clear objective for your career growth and then plan and execute accordingly. So with all these years of experience internationally, what was your favorite learning? Or maybe you could answer the question as, how has a failure or apparent failure set you up for later success?
I remember I was a young, kind of brash American who came into Japan leading an all 100% Japanese organization. One day, the executive in charge of all manufacturing in Japan pulled me in his office and he said, you got a second, I want to talk to you. And so he took out of his desk a piece of rope and he laid it on his desk. And he said, what happens when you push a rope? And it doesn't go anywhere, right? It just bunches up. He said, but what happens when you pull a rope? And it goes wherever you want. If you pull it up, it'll go up. If you pull it down, it'll go down. He said, in Japan, you pull, you don't push. And he was advising me that, a real lesson from my career in Asia, that if you want to lead an organization in Asia, you have to tell them what great looks like. You have to show them what you want to do and pull them up. You don't sit there and tell them, do this, do that, do this, do that. You just basically tell them where you want to go and how those things will make everything better. And then everybody will be at the feet to your door. Another example was I was in Korea. I remember I was there for about a month and I was telling people all the things that we should go work on and do. And nothing was happening. Nothing was happening. And I went to the CEO and I said, I'm trying to understand how things work here. And he said, you're not asking it the right way. You should ask for a tear down rebuild. There's a Korean word for it, TDR, it's a Japanese term. And I said, a TDR? He said, yeah, you ask for a TDR and it'll happen. So I went, I reshaped all the same questions I had, to things I wanted to look at, like cost this or cost that or whatever. And I asked like a TDR, and sure enough, a TDR is a team, a group of people that get together and work on a problem together. Where in America, you might ask somebody to go do something. In Korea, it had to be a team. And so you had to have a team solution in order to get something done. So you learn that every culture and every environment has different ways of executing things and how to operate, the nuances between different cultures. Then I went to another foreign country called California, and obviously very, very different. The California workforce is, more akin to herding cats because, everybody's strong and independent and has their own ideas and wants to do things a certain way. So you have to facilitate your management style to accommodate getting things done in that environment. So innovation and things like that are very important in California, especially in Silicon Valley. And so you have to facilitate a way by which innovation and those values can kind of come through in your management style. So yeah, I mean, it's different. Singapore, I was there for a long time, and that was very structured, very disciplined, almost military style in terms of the culture. So every country, everything's different. People talk about the challenges in China or the challenges in Europe, and you just have to, I think, understand the nuances of a culture and fit into it. I always say culture is like the wind, right? You can stand there and say, I'm stopping the wind. No, you're not stopping the wind. The wind is just going around you. You feel you're stopping the wind, but really the wind is just going around you. And culture is like that. Culture is like the wind. You have to make sure that you're going with it and not trying to go against it.
Those are great stories with different countries, even regions, bring a different culture element. As a global supply chain executives, what is your favorite place in all of those places that you have traveled and worked?
I would say from a heart standpoint, Japan, from a head standpoint, maybe Singapore, from a job standpoint, probably Korea, just because, the Korea system of execution is so superior. It's so well aligned. The Japanese have a word called Hoshin Kanri, or even Hoshin Tenkai, which is really alignment of a management system, so that when the top says do something, the bottom is doing it by the end of the day. In the United States, if the top says do something on Monday, you'd be lucky if it's starting by Friday. So they're all good in their own way. They're all different in their own way. I also spent most of a year for IBM in Central America. I was in Barbados. Intel had actually a manufacturing plant there, believe it or not. And I was sent down there to be a program manager for the factory. And I remember showing up at the factory there. They started at like 7:30 in the morning. And then by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it was over. The factory was closed. It was done the day, because everybody had to go home and go to the beach or go relax. I was, wait a minute, where'd everybody go? Right, 3 o'clock. This day's half over. So I think you learn that you have to understand it and you have to go with the flow, because you can't resist it.
Yeah, and maybe we can also later on explore tension we're dealing with related to culture. Before that, I'd like to share the poll question on the screen. What is your understanding of supply chain? It's a multiple choice question. So we have logistic and transportation, supplier network, manufacturing, procurement, demand planning, inventory management, strategic sourcing, cost management, all above. As you can tell that the answer is widely spread. So there's many different words people use as a substitute for supply chain. That's very interesting. People perceive what supply chain does. Tom, I would like to move on with you. So supply chain has been a living system, right, in our daily life for more than 100 years. However, most people didn't pay attention to its significance until 2020, when the pandemic disrupted the global supply chain from food availabilities to household necessities to medical essentials. To compare and contrast, people are generally aware and even knowledgeable about the industrial revolution and globalization. For example, we're in the fourth industrial revolution and the era of globalization 4.0. So question for you, Tom, in your opinion, why didn't supply chain gain popularity until now?
Well, it's very, very similar to manufacturing. I mean, manufacturing really did the Industrial Revolution. People like Henry Ford and others actually created first mass production and followed by now mass customization. So I think business evolves. And right now, supply chain is all of a sudden the connecting tissue between a global economy. And when it was primarily the United States producing for the United States or Europe for Europe, maybe wasn't as big of a deal. But as the economies have expanded and become more integrated, I think supply chain just rose to the top, just naturally. It just became more important. And even now, I was listening to the news this morning about the issues around Ukraine and Europe and Russia. And right now, they're so integrated between what goes into Russia and what comes out of Russia that the war would basically cause problems for everybody. It's a non-winnable war. So I think that's true of supply chain. And we're already seeing that in corporate world. I mean, supply chains win when those companies have excellent supply chains, and companies lose when supply chains are weak. So I think it's just evolutionary. Supply chains just have evolved now to the point where they're more important.
I also like to spend some time talking about modernized supply chain. So you co-authored the book, The Living Supply Chain. And could you tell us more about the book and why you chose the word "the living" to describe supply chain?
Yeah, well, there were some acronyms involved, but the real premise behind it was supply chains can collapse or succeed based upon how well balanced they are. A good example of it is, remember when Samsung Galaxy phone had its issues, going back probably 5-7 years ago, when they pulled the Galaxy phone out of production for about a year, the supply chain that was supporting that phone collapsed, right? Because all the companies that were building the parts, the screens, the printed circuit boards, the batteries and all that stuff, all of a sudden they weren't shipping any product. It's kind of like, when you take the wolves out of Montana, right? The elk eat all the trees and all of a sudden then they starve to death because there's too many elk and not enough food supply. So this idea of balance in supply chains is so important, and all the more reason why you need to have balance in the number of sharks or OEMs that you have. If you think about semiconductor people, and no insult meant for semiconductor companies, but they're like fish, right? They actually are feeding the products with parts. It's unbalanced because the semiconductor guys didn't have enough parts to feed the sharks, and some of the sharks are dying out because they can't get enough fish. So it's OEMs and it's the structure and it's balanced. And when it's unbalanced, you've got supply chain issues. And when it's balanced, you have thriving economies and thriving companies. So the living concept is really that biological analogy to what's healthy and what's not, and how efficient companies can be and how effective they can be is taking care of their suppliers, treating them correctly, and suppliers treating their customers correctly, and then planning and integrating their thinking, and the supply demand story needs to be well planned. Right now, one of the major reasons the semiconductor companies are running out of parts is because electrification, vehicles, and the epidemic amount of utilizations now for a connected economy. I mean, you got streetlights talking to stoplights, and you got stoplights talking to cars, and you got everything is connected. So the semiconductors, and we all knew that was going to happen, and yet the amount of supply or the amount of investment necessary to go after that demand just never was made at the right time. So now you have an imbalance and things are not healthy. And anyway, that's the living biological analogy.
So as a living phenomenon for more than a century, right? And by the way, it's across every industry and it's a global scale. So there is an essential and intangible property in the supply chain, whether you call it an energy, a spirit, a soul. So supply chain professionals sense its presence. So do their partners and customers. It inspires people to contribute their talent, commitment, and foster a sense of belongings and a mutual purpose. So Tom, from your experience, what is the soul of supply chain?
You know, if there is a soul in supply chain, people have mentioned that a soul is really what the heart and the head are doing together, right? And for me, the heart of a supply chain is the clock speed, the heartbeat. The heart is pumping the blood through the system, right? So it's a rhythm. It's the daily speed and the processes and the capabilities that actually drive the heart to pump the blood through the system. But the design of the supply chain really is coming from the head. How did airports decide to use hubs? How did railroad stations to lay themselves out the way they lay the infrastructure, the national highway system? How are things organized and how are they designed? That comes from the head. So the supply chain has also got to have the head or the design, as well as the clock speed, the rhythm, the beat of the business in order to work. So if there's a soul, it's the combination of how things are designed and how things flow and how things work together in that context. And in that way, you actually have a moving ecosystem, right? You have an efficiently moving system. I co-authored an article in June called Our Pan-American Manufacturing Ecosystem in the Harvard Business Review. And what really it pointed out was something very profound. China just had a train move from Beijing all the way to Paris this past week. I'm just really highlighting the connectivity of Europe and Asia. But yet you cannot even ride a bicycle or a motorcycle between Alaska and Puerto del Fuego, on the southern tip of South America. You know, there's no way down there. We are unconnected, the North American continent and the South American continent. That's a shame. We've got to figure out how to do that. We need a Pan-America supply chain ecosystem if we're going to thrive 50 years from now. So this concept of design and speed and movement, I think it's just table stakes. It's almost, it's the underlying theory of how the supply chain needs to be executed in the next century. And if we want to survive and thrive, we're going to have to figure out how to do that better. We can't be flying things at high cost and all the carbon involved. We can't be putting things on a slow boat from China for 30 days. These things are just not going to advance supply chains. They've got to be faster. They've got to be more regional. They've got to be more local. And they've got to be, done in a way that actually, facilitates the reduction in carbon, which is driving climate change. So, I mean, all those things. Mm-hmm. That's a short answer to a very complicated.
It is a very complex ecosystem, as well as the challenges that we're facing forward looking might be different compared to the last 30 years. We asked the audience the question, does supply chain have a soul? And it's a single choice question. So 46% answered yes, 13% answered no, and 42% answered maybe.
I've met a lot of people who basically don't have a soul, so that matches.
Hopefully this is the beginning of a many conversation we may have around these topics. Yeah. So I like to utilizing some knowledge and the story as well as analogy used earlier to apply to today's situation. We are living in a pandemic as well as a supply chain disruption. Many people would call supply chain crisis today. What are systematic problems that we actually could fix?
Well, the number one thing that we can fix is get a handle on what is true demand. My big concern right now is, and I'm sure many on this session would share that, there's a lot of double booking going on. It's the same thing, right? If you want to go buy a refrigerator for your house, you get on 3 waiting lists, right? So this is true in companies today. They're ordering in multiple places for the same demand. So my concern is what's about to happen, and I hope it doesn't, but I'm afraid it will, is sometime in the next 6 months, we're going to hit an air pocket and all of a sudden the economy is going to shake and all of a sudden this artificial demand is going to go away and it will drop like a rock. It happened in 2008, 2009. It happened 2001, 2002. It happened 94, 95. It happened 88, 89. I mean, I've seen this story play itself out And right now you've got overheated, everybody says demand is high. Is it really that high? Or is it just high because of the shortages that are facilitating an heightened artificial demand? Somehow we have to kind of get our heads around how that artificial demand gets taken out. Some companies saying they discount the demand that they're getting because, especially people in distribution, they see people ordering the same parts in different ways. So I would be a caution right now that something to be fixed. The other thing is this reliance on so many nodes in the chain. I think there is a stronger argument now, and you see it happening with people like Amazon buying their own planes and their own trucks. But I think there's an argument that we've gone too far with supply chains being broken apart. I think there's a strong argument for vertical integration, where, remember, Henry Ford actually worked to make the rubber tires and build the car. So in the 70s and 80s, companies broke apart. We had 3PLs doing logistics, contract manufacturers doing manufacturing, and everything went, and it got fragmented. So there is an argument that if you have more control over your own destiny, you're more vertically integrated. Or in the case of like Amazon buying their own jets or Walmart buying their own trucks, there's an argument for more control over your destiny. I read some people are buying their own ships even. I think that fixing this current problem might be taking more things under your own control. So the chief supply chain officers might be having more vertical control versus the disintegrated or the segmented amount of control that exists in many companies today. So I think the pendulum has gone a little too far in one direction. It might be coming back. I'm not sure everybody's going to make their own semiconductors, but they might be designing them. Apple is designing their own M1 chip, right, for their phone, and they used to outsource that. Some companies who have the means are definitely rethinking this whole supply chain thing.
So what do you think the biggest supply chain opportunities will be?
I think the biggest opportunities in supply chain are going to be in compressing time. If we talk about speed and we talk about material in motion, then we have to talk about time. So time is the measurement of business. It's a quarterly clock. It's a weekly clock. It's a daily clock. If you ask yourself one question in your supply chain management every day, say, what am I doing to compress time? What am I doing to speed this thing up? What am I doing to actually produce things, whether it's a process or robotic process automation, or if it's the speed by which I get purchase orders out the door, whatever it is. I always tell people, I said, if you don't know what to work on, just think about how to do something faster, and you're going to be making a contribution to the supply chain. Trucks can only go so fast, but you can design things differently, or you can look at other avenues to make things better. I used to have this talk called It's About Time. It was kind of fun, right? Because it's about time. It is kind of where my head's at.
We have a question from Jimmy that to expand your view in terms of regionalization versus localization versus the last 20, 30 years that we have been gone for, and globalization, which is more centric around Asia or China. Do you have a strong view in terms of where we're heading to in the next era?
I think that regional economies are going to grow in strength. Just having things stretched across the world has never been helpful. I think we did it for cost regions. The labor arbitrage drove people to China because it was cheaper. But now that things are less cheaper in China, then the investments, you can already see it happening. They're flowing back into the United States. And you might say, well, that's great for the United States, but actually it's pretty much just a clear-cut business decision. Things are getting expensive to either move or to build or to even hire managers. It costs more in China now than it does in the US. Labor has always been the things that business chase. We chased it when in the 70s in Mexico. We chased it to Japan. Remember, made in Japan back in the 70s, that was a cheap alternative. And then all of a sudden it became not. And then what happened? Well, and they moved to Singapore and Taiwan and Hong Kong and then China. So there's a constant, push. Robotics is going to change that. I mean, robotics is basically where's the lowest cost capital, right? Because you got to finance these machines. They cost money and you got to depreciate them. So where's capital going to be cheap? Where's the technology and the skills to run them? You're going to see more of that moving away from third world or developing nations towards developed ones. I think that's probably a good bet. I wouldn't encourage people to invest on my advice, but you can see that making sense.
Mm-hmm. So besides cost, you also mentioned some people start buying logistic company or the tools to get them more in-house integrated. What are some tensions, conflicts, or maybe even trade-offs to frame the current risk and opportunity that corporate executives are facing?
Well, risk and resiliency is number one on most CFOs and CEOs' agenda. What I encourage people to do now is, don't rely on your first tier suppliers to tell you what's going on in the second and third tier. You have to map your own supply chain. You have to go deep and understand what's happening. I often compare a product to a genome. We talk about like 23andMe, all our DNA. And so the DNA is really like part numbers in a phone. Your phone has DNA, but it's in part numbers and the barcodes that are on everything. So if you think about mapping the supply chain of your products, you're really going deep into the product to look for problems in the DNA, problems in the phone that might cause you to miss your sustainability targets, or might cause you to miss your business objectives, or might cause you to be short on some supplier, maybe even worse. Most people are now coming to the conclusion that they have to map and understand deeply everything about their product. I don't think people are going to stand for products that are made with things that they don't understand, especially consumers today. They're going to be more critical of that. This whole push by the next generation to make sure everything is repurposable, the circular economy, and everything you buy kind of has to have a way of being used again somehow. Those are the major things that I would suggest.
So in order to make the next era of supply chain happen, obviously need talent. So since we're in UC San Diego, what educational background do you believe that will somebody make a good supply chain leader?
I know we have a lot of supply chain professionals probably are going to listen to this. And I would say, first of all, the most important thing is don't be afraid of the fires. If you go into supply chain, you have to be the kind of person that when you see smoke, you go to put out the fire. You have to be a problem solver. You have to be somebody who's willing to know that you're stepping into the heat of battle. This is not where you sit down and do your work and you go home, because things from supply chain actually come at you all the time from left field. You don't know what's going to happen next. So you have to be willing to do that. But I also think you need to have a broad background. If in my office, I always had a sign which says think, and I got it from IBM because IBM's slogan was think. But don't be afraid to think. I still think a lot. I still apply for patents. I have patents in supply chain, and what it does is it basically says think about it more. If you got an hour every day, don't be afraid to spend 20 minutes just thinking. Don't just do. Just don't react. I think that's important. If you're choosing your courses and you're trying to understand what it is you want to do, make sure your strengths align with what you're choosing, but don't be afraid to take courses in engineering and data analytics and go into some unfriendly or some unknown areas and learn about them, and you'll be curious. And curious is going to mean that you're going to put together things in ways that no one's thought about yet, and you're going to think about it and come up with your own conclusions. I mean, anybody who's in the connected world today is probably going to look back at 2022 and say, wow, that was pretty primitive, what they were doing back then. I think there's going to be a lot more use cases for technologies that we currently are not using in supply chain. And those are going to come from more the technical and engineering side. So figure out from a business side and a technical side how to put those together in new and interesting ways, and you're going to find a better way forward.
We have a question from the audience asking, how different do you think your approach to business would be without the international experience?
My world would be much smaller. United Airlines got, I think, 3.5 million miles out of me. But you got to think about just how big this world is. I was just talking to somebody this morning about China. And, people who have never been to China but have an idea about China should really go there, because the scale and the size of China is beyond most people's comprehension. When people think about the United States, they should think about, okay, well, if you've never been to the West Coast, or you've never been to the East Coast, you've never been to the South, you should really understand these places, because when you work in sourcing, your suppliers are going to be all over the place. If you don't really have an appreciation or an understanding of it, it really is hard to either accommodate what they may be asking for, or maybe you're not asking for enough. It's just something that from international experience, I would say would be important. I've never been one to learn languages as much because English is pretty well spoken, but I've encouraged my kids, they all speak Chinese. I think it's important to also enter into the language as well.
As a tradition for season 2, I hope to build an intellectual bridge between the current and future generation. Einstein said any intellectual fool can make things bigger and more complex. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. Tom, I would like to partner with leaders like you to make supply chain simpler and easier to understand. How would you paint a picture for supply chain management by giving it a new perspective?
Well, one of the things I've been dabbling in recently is fractal mathematics. It's a new mathematics that was really coined in the 1970s, but it says basically there are patterns in everything, mathematical patterns. Look at leaves on a tree, they repeat. Leaves of grass in a lawn, they repeat. Waves in the ocean, they have a frequency. So when it comes to supply chain, you can't violate those laws. You've got to look at how things flow and how things move. And this kind of thinking much differently than way we've ever thought before, I think will help us a lot as we think about what supply chains should be in the future and look at the pattern, look at it differently. When you sit there and you'll have an aha moment. I guarantee you, you go to a loading dock or you go to a factory floor or you go to a supplier and you think about it in that kind of way, a different way, when you look at it, wow, this doesn't feel right. And your instincts or your gut's telling you this something's wrong. What is it? It's probably violating some pattern of movement, or it's violating some pattern that is intrinsic in the design of nature. And I think those are things that are really fascinate me.
Well, very fascinating idea. We're looking forward to more discovery and conclusion coming from your side in terms of supply chain pattern. I love it. And in spirit of exchanging ideas with you, I also prepared one. So here you go. Supply and demand are on opposite teams, playing an ongoing tug of war. First, the demand team decides the total weight, equal to market size. Then, the supply team tries to match the weight, equal to capacity. By lining up the best combination of players, think of supply chain design and formation, strategizing weight distributions through price adjustment, and practicing speed and movement for flexibility to maximize the overall forces. When the supply team loses the game, it's called a shortage. But when the demand team loses the game, it's called surplus or excess. Then the next round continues. The soul of supply chain lifts to create a stronger and longer pull within the tug of war. We have more questions. There's different kind of leadership or operating styles. Which one, compare Japan versus Korea, Singapore, do you enjoy the most, and which is most effective for business and why?
Well, I think as an employee, you have to appreciate and like the American style. Tends to be more flexible, more understanding, a little more friendly. I mean, not all management styles are that way. Because I'm an American and because I grew up in America, I kind of gravitate towards being comfortable with that management style. But I've worked for Germans, I've worked for Japanese, I've worked for French people, and I've worked for men and I've worked for women. So you go on and on. You're always going to be comfortable with your own culture just because that's how your mom and dad and your family raised you. But I think flexibility today amongst a workforce, we call this the great resignation right now, because people are like, if they're not working for somebody that makes them feel fulfilled, they leave. They're going to go somewhere. So I think managers have to be very alert to making sure that the jobs that they're designing are fun and interesting. I mean, supply chain has to be the most fun and most interesting job on the planet. I can't imagine anybody wanting to go do any other function, right? I mean, they go to work every day and they actually have a job to do. In supply chain, you go to work and you actually are saving the world. I think it's just how you approach it and how you think about it. But me, I've always gravitated towards being more comfortable with the American management system. But that's not to say I didn't learn a lot and I didn't have major problems with the others. You have to be flexible. Flexibility is the key.
Another question, given the current crunch and impact, do you see an increasing trend in companies considering supply chain finance or insurance for risk mitigation?
Supply chain finance is so important. Supply chain is about the balance sheet. Purchasing is about the income statement, and having a close alignment with the KOIs of the company, with the operating indicators of a supply chain. I mean, how that's put together is so important. I can't understate how important that is. At Flex, for example, I was trying to reduce days of supply, which is really a measurement of how long you hold inventory until you sell it. We focused on reducing 1 day. 1 day was equal to like $59 million. If we reduce 10 days, you take out $590 million, and that's cash. So reducing days of supply and aligning it with sales and demand, how much more interesting can a job be than trying to figure that stuff out? That's just really, really, really cool. And what we find in companies all the time is they overorder, they have a lot of raw material. Why? Because they don't want to run out of parts. Or they have a lot of finished goods because they don't want to turn down a sale. But in reality, they weigh down the balance sheet and they weigh down a company's use of cash. And so how quickly can you align? Well, you do that by rapid fulfillment. You do that by short lead times. You do that by efficient manufacturing. You do that by supply chain design. And you can knock hundreds of millions of dollars out of a company's balance sheet just by focusing on how efficiently that supply chain is organized. And to me, that's incredibly exciting.
That almost leads me to thinking about a combination of your first book, Living Supply Chain, as well as your second book, Flow of Supply Chain. Maybe Living and Flow will form a pattern that you're looking for. So when will you have the new book?
I think it's going to come out next month, from what I hear, Toronto University Press. It's up on Amazon already for pre-order. The title with Rob Hanfield, is my co-author, is Flow, How the Best Supply Chains Thrive. And we really get into talking about things like proximity. If you really want a super efficient supply chain, don't have things that are feeding your supply chain far away, because it takes time and therefore it slows down your supply chain. So, there's a physical law of physics in supply chain called proximity, which means things need to be close by. Things like that really jump out as important. What's kind of fascinating, we're already talking about a third book, more on the social supply chain, because I think there's another whole dynamic there, which I won't get into here. Just thinking about supply chains in these kind of ways, I think will give us some insights into what we might do better. There's no answers. I have no answers in the book, but different ways to think about it, I think would be the way I'd say it.
Yeah, this is exactly what we need. The purpose of this program is to bring new perspectives. So Tom, I truly enjoyed our conversation today. Thanks for your devotion to the field of supply chain. Thanks for sharing your vision and wisdom with us. And finally, I wanted to congratulate our audience for being part of the first discussion in the history and on record to search the soul of supply chain. I look forward to seeing you again in the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thanks for listening to Oceanside Chat. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you liked it, please share this podcast and stay tuned for our next episode. We'll see you later.